Hello and welcome to the 16th of December. Christmas is coming and the goose is getting fat. At least I think that's a goose. It could be Nick in his goose costume. Anyway, let's have a look at today's Advent question. We've had quite a selection this year, so I've no idea whether this one will be fun or frivolous or serious or downright silly. Let's have a look. Okay. This is an interesting question. I heard Sidley? That's similar to Sydney. Separated at birth, obviously. Talk about this the other day, and his musings on night fighting interested me. Here we go. What do you consider to be difficult rules to create? What aspect of warfare do you think is the most difficult to model and represent in a war game? And how do you feel you've overcome that? And possibly, where do you feel there's more to do? Well, Sid's musings the other day were very interesting, especially with Go Commando front of mind. And he's stolen my thunder a bit, as night fighting is a really pithy old chestnut that I haven't yet seen anything done to my liking, but it did cause a flurry of discussions, and some real ideas have come out of hearing Sydney musing on that the other day, as I said. What I'm going to talk about here is not so much an aspect of warfare, but the part of our gaming that presents problems when trying to replicate reality, and that's the war games table itself. As many of you will know, I feel very pleased that war games tables today are generally miles better visually than they were 20 years ago. I think the advance of technology has allowed us to improve the visuals a lot. 3D printing has been a fabulous boon, with all sorts of scatter now available. That means the days of Brillo pad hedges and houses plonked in the middle of an empty table haven't quite disappeared, but they're certainly far more rare. Our battlefields look much more like reality than they used to. Lots of sheds and gardens and fences and backyards, and even things like dustbins and flower pots on the window that really bring the game to life. But there are some issues that remain. Space and its use is important in war games, as is the fact that a war games table is finite. It has very definite beginnings and ends. What we're able to represent on our 6x4 table is often, by necessity, a distortion of reality. I was looking at some really nicely made, commercially available fields recently. They were on MDF bases with a stone wall around them. And then you think, hold on a minute, they're 12 inches square, and no matter how nice they are, they do, in reality, only really represent a very small piece of land. I mean, in a game like Chain of Command, 12 inches square is like 120 foot square field. That's 40 yards. That's smaller than my garden, and I've only got a very average house. And a field that size wouldn't be commercially viable since the end of strip farming. In reality, this would possibly be a small rural garden rather than a field, and that would be unlikely to be ploughed into furrows. However, the limited space on our tables leads us to distort the contents to get the desired visual effect. Even when I'm just walking the dog, it's apparent that a war games table represents an area of only, let's say, 240 yards by 160 yards if we're talking Chain of Command. And quite often that would just be a completely open field with no hedges around the edge of it. It's just because we plonk it in the middle and that would be it. My solution to this when designing point-sized campaigns is actually to double the dimensions of the area I represent when I lift the terrain from 1 to 25,000 map. I tend to look at areas about 500 yards by 300 yards, and that tends to allow me to give me a more appropriate content that looks right on the game table. It's a bit of a blunt instrument solution to a problem of scale that wargames create, but it does allow us to get a more interesting tactical conundrum on the table rather than sticking precisely to the figure scale. But actually this pales into insignificance when we consider the real problem of wargames tables, which is that they stop rather abruptly at the edges. Dealing with the edges of wargames tables is a constant problem, as traditionally the edge of the table has been treated as the edge of a flat earth world. Things that fall off don't come back, or at least they have a difficult time coming back. There's a big difference between an infantry section retreating 6 inches when it ends up still on the table, and one retreating 6 inches and ending up off the table. The one that's on the table can still function. It's still very much part of the game. It can shoot at you. You can shoot at it. You can see where it is. You can see what it's doing. The section that retreats off the table, even though it might only by an inch or so, is a very different kettle of fish. It's now invisible. It's disappeared into a vacuum of uncertainty. How we treat it will, of course, depend on the game that we're playing. In Chain of Command, it's gone for good. We can justify that by the fact that it will have retreated because of an excess of shock. It's retreated out of the location where combat is occurring and it's not keen to return. It's a pretty simple narrative to support the way we feel it should happen. However, the fact remains, it may only be an inch or two off the table and really could potentially still be playing an active part in the battle. If it's retreated out of the zone of combat, it's done so in order to presumably to rally. So it is a conundrum. One solution seems to be another blunt instrument, but again, we live with that because that's the solution that's a lot easier than wrestling with the conundrum that the table edge sets. AFVs are actually more problematic in Chain of Command than infantry units because they deploy on the roads at the table edge. And a lucky first shot with an anti-tank rifle or anti-tank gun can actually see them reverse off the table almost immediately. Now, that's quite funny the first time it happens, but you don't want it happening too regularly. And people realise after a few games that when it says you can treat the road as a jump-off point, deploying 6 inches off the road is usually a better idea than deploying onto it. But in such situations, we've taken to allowing those vehicles to return on subsequent turns, but we treat them as though they're under a bombardment. It just means they've been driven off and there is some delay in them returning. It seems to be a sensible compromise, even though it's not in the rules. But there are actually even bigger issues with table edges. In most games, table edges are not the open flank they should be, but are a secure flank that we can pivot off in the knowledge that nothing is coming at us from that direction. It represents an area into which we cannot see, but where we have complete confidence that it's completely secure. This is the very opposite of what it should be. In Infamy, I attempted to create the uncertainty of Publius Quinctilius Varus as he moved through the Teutoburger with every tree a potential threat with the ambush and deployment points in that game. But that's unusual in our games. In the forthcoming Far East and Pacific handbooks, games set in jungles see ambush range extended longer than they are in the main rules, and the number of troops able to take part in an ambush is also increased. So ambushes in that terrain become potentially more deadly, as seems appropriate. In any Chain of Command game, the patrol phase can see the table twist and flanks become threatened, but this is still a relatively imperfect reflection of the uncertainty and concern that an open flank should present a commander with. So, what's the solution? Well, most gamers tend to view a flank attack as a scenario-specific event rather than something available in all games, and that there is a wiseness to that. If we simply said X number of points buys you a flank attack, the advantages are so significant that almost every game would end up being that. A flank attack has the advantage that not only is it turning up somewhere unexpected, but it also can't be seen as it approaches because of the invisibility cloak that is draped over it, as thick as any impenetrable fog. If we're going to offer that option, so many points for a flank attack, we would need to consider adding in the defender's option of flank guards to serve as an off-table alarm system that even they could use to post troops off-table to guard that flank, and maybe even a mechanism for that flank guard to fight a delaying action to harass the flank attackers. Possibly roll a d6 to see how many turns they delay the flanking force for. But as soon as we do that, we then allow the flank force to become reinforced there, or maybe strengthen the flank guards further to allow them to hold them off for longer, and all of a sudden we get into an arms race where the flank attack actually becomes the main attack, and we may as well make that the actual game. And often all of these decisions, what's happening on the flank, is decided by the roll of a d6. There's not a lot of tactical input into that, which seems a shame when that's exactly what we're trying to model. Flanks on a war games table are problematic. We see that clearly when we play a Kriegspiel on a large-scale map where the drawing up of the battle lines is rarely a linear affair, nor is it one where the battle commences at the firing of a starter pistol. Rather, it's far more nuanced, where armies probe, send out scouts, patrols, and attempt to determine where their opponent is, and then manoeuvre to come into contact in the most advantageous manner. If we're going to reflect that on the tabletop, we probably need to rethink the way war games begin and what the table edges represent. I fear that overcoming this is something that I won't be doing here, but maybe throwing this into the ring will encourage a discussion, as Sydney's night fighting chat did. And we certainly have far more to do in this area going forward. What do you think?